crazy, go crazy, go crazy, no crazy, no crazy, no crazy,
Hi, I'm Xonin. Well, more weekly than Xonin right now. We're about 13 days into the new year, and I'm already hoping that there's a time skip. Is there like at least a leap year? Damn. Since we have all the time in the world, why don't you kick back and let me talk to you about Vinland Saga? Yeah, that's right. From time to time, I tend to follow through on my promises. Though I might be late as Helga, I'm here. And I have a lot to say about this show. Full transparency alert, I binged the first season of the show earlier this week and had to rewatch the second half because it was just that good. The way things build to the climax that basically begins in episode 17 and carries onward is insane. I really thought these characters were just being built up to be used in the second season, but no, things get heavy real fast. And in this time span, for example, Canute goes from bottom 2, and he's not 2, to possibly top 5. But obviously we'll see if that changes with the introduction of this scene's cast of characters, because this first episode was, pretty good. So let's jump into it. The episode starts off with this engrave hymn, and many images are paired with the lines in it, so let's go through them one by one. Engrave it upon your body is paired with the scene of a blacksmith taking some swings at a sword. We see him sporting a tattoo, which is not the Helm of All like I initially thought. It's the Vegvisir. The Vegvisir, also known as the Viking compass, is a symbol meant to prevent the person carrying it from losing their way. Given that we're seeing this on the blacksmith, I'm the one, could interpret this as a sort of imprinting or branding of the compass by way of repetition, similar to how a sword is forged through careful yet constant hammering. I won't get into the semantics with the rest of these lines, but since I'm an anime only, I want to do my best to understand what this hymn is trying to tell us. Engrave means to cut in or make an incision, but usually on a hard surface, which the skin isn't normally, unless you're a Viking obviously. But just so there's no confusion, the word engrave connects back to the Old Norse word grafa, which means to dig, sort of like digging into the skin, which is how tattoos are made. The next line, engrave it upon the land, seems to be referring to the act of farming, which is also a pretty hard task that involves digging. And if you remember just how hard the newbies had to work to row Thor's boat last season, you'll know that engraving anything upon the sea is hard. Not just because it's impossible to engrave water, but because seafaring is difficult and a dangerous task. But since we're being technical, I guess the act of rowing an oar in and out of water does count as engraving, although temporarily. The next line, engrave it upon your enemy, is rather simple in this context. Carve your enemy up with your sword. Or is it referring to something else? See, this is where the it in these lines starts to come into its meaning. What is it exactly that we're trying to engrave? Well, what can one engrave into their own body, the land, the sea, and an enemy? The answer lies in this last line. Well, more precisely, the image is shown during this last line. Engrave it upon your loot. The loot here refers to a more general idea of treasure. The image we're given here is of slaves. So, engrave it upon your slaves. But what can you engrave upon a slave? Well, you can mark them in many ways, like with trauma, branding, or even a tattoo. But what you engrave upon them is your will. Don't talk about One Piece, don't talk about One Piece. Slaves must obey the commands of their master. An enemy has your will engraved upon them literally with your sword, but also when they're defeated in battle. The sea is moving you because you're moving it, and your body is not engraved by the symbols you mark it with, but by the will represented by those markings. What supports this is the image showed at the end, of the last man falling to this unnamed warrior. With the defeat of his last foe, the warrior's will is finally carried out, confirmed by the crowd, and then passed on to the child. Don't talk about One Piece. The last line of this hymn, engrave your warmth upon me, is what I believe to be a plea to the gods. Sure, it can also signify the warmth bestowed to the child, but given the imagery leading up to this last line, and what we learned about love last season, I'm feeling like this line represents the realization of the narrator's sin. This man has just commanded everything in these shots, either by overseeing them or causing them, sort of like a king would. So after realizing the cost of carrying out one's will, he asks for forgiveness. Just after this, we get our first glimpse of Einar, engraving his own will on this tree, essentially committing the same sin of harming life without consideration. Yeah, I'm a big tree guy. Now you can blame my top 10 anime for this, or you can realize this is Norse mythology, where a tree is the literal center of the world. But what's actually to blame here is the what is love scene from last season. Although this hymn does tie into the episode as a whole, engrave is also the first word spoken this season, barring the opening, which I won't be getting into. So I think it's something we should keep in the back of our minds since it is something that ties into the series as a whole. Einar's story does seem to stem from trying to carry out his own father's will, but his story right now is tied into this episode, which finally brings us into the title of this episode, slavery, or slave. In the words of the late, great Askeladd Artorius, everyone's a slave to something. Some masters are slaves to their coin, soldiers are slaves to their king, warriors are slaves to battle, and some people are slaves to their past. Luckily, he encounters two men this episode who remind us of the nuances of slavery. Nuance? The first is Leif, who is still on a mission to free his people, specifically the second man that Einar encounters this episode, Thorvin. Though he was freed from Askeladd's shackles last season, the last time we saw Thorvin, he was still very much a slave to his revenge, never able to get past the idea of engraving his will upon his enemy. It makes Leif's pursuit of him much more wholesome because he's not just trying to free his slave friend, he's trying to free Thorvin's soul. Lucky for me, since I love dissecting literature, we get a passage from the Havamal, which translates to Words of Havi. Havi, also known as the High One, is also another name for Odin. More importantly though, the High One is also a reference to the act of using mushrooms to ascend, allegedly. Anyway, the excerpt reads, "A fir tree standing on barren land dies, with no bark nor leaves to shelter it. So is a man whom no one loves. Why should he keep living?" Since the Netflix subs make this sound like a riddle, I didn't understand this excerpt at first. So, I looked up the Havamal and found a much clearer translation. This version reads, "The pine tree wastes, which is perched on the hill. Nor bark nor needles shelter it. Such is the man whom none doth love. For what should he longer live?" Now it actually sounds like a poem. If we take the two readings, barren lands implies a hopelessness in the world around the tree, while perched on a hill implies a sort of loneliness, which is reinforced by the second line, "Nor bark nor leaves, or needles, to shelter it." Either way you look at it, whether it's due to the lack of community or the barren land, the tree is destined to die under these conditions. The second half of this tells us that man is no different than a tree. Yes, Einar losing his family and falling into slavery does sound like a tree wasting away, but Canute, after realizing that he's now alone in this world with the death of Ragnar, seemingly forces himself to sprout in spite of these circumstances. Einar, on the other hand, is freshly withered when he meets Thorvin. And that's perfect, because although Thorvin may have also forced himself to grow, he did so through the power of revenge. So the reason Einar looks so shocked here isn't just because he realizes, oh, this is the same guy that old guy was looking for. It's because he's looking at a strong tree that bears no leaves, and that's why it's perfect, because it makes sense for these two men to meet here. Unfortunately, that's the end of the episode. Much like us, Einar is very excited to see Thorvin, and I can't blame him. Obviously, there's been another time skip. I don't want to assume that Thorvin's only fallen deeper into his Askeladd void, but you never know. At least, I don't, because once again, I'm going in blind, boys. See, Book 1 only covers the first 4 episodes of Season 1, which serves as the series prologue, climaxing in Thor's death. Although it's not the event that sparks the Great Pirate Era, it's where a lot of the series connects back to. You got Thorvin and Thorkel, Thorvin and Askeladd, Floki and Askeladd, and in a way we get our first glimpse of how the politics play out here via the plot to kill Thors. Yeah, sorry, since I didn't get to review Season 1, this is kind of just me slipping in some kind of breakdown of it. In a way, Einar is both beginning his journey and returning from it in this episode. He's like the Jormungandr, sailing the sea and circling right back to where he was. I'm also just looking forward to seeing where Einar goes, since he was one of the characters teased at the end of Season 1. Or, you know, maybe they throw us a curveball, and this encounter is just that. An encounter that Einar has with Thorvin before going off on his own journey. This episode's already thrown me for a loop though. I fully believe that we'd be getting a whole "I gotta free my sister" storyline, but then she just gets axed and I'm there like, okay. I can't wait to see how Thorvin's been though. I assume since the last time we saw him he wasn't in very good shape that maybe he's still trying to find himself, but who knows, it's a time skip. Maybe he's already engraved his own path. That's all from me today. If I can leave you with just one thing, it's to go read the Havamal. It's got some good verses that might come into play this season. I know when I was doing research for this episode that there were a lot of ties to trees, so maybe you'll catch some things that I missed. If you do, please be sure to leave them in the comment section below. In the meantime, I hope you all have a great weekend. Travel safe. I'll see you soon. Bye.